Out of all the insane and amazing cameos that we saw during X-Men 97, one of my favorites from the show was the brief appearance of Daredevil fighting crime in Hell's Kitchen. Especially since we didn't get to see that many Daredevil appearances in the original 90s Marvel animated shows, besides a couple episodes from Fantastic Four and Spider-Man. But a little known fact is that we almost got to see Daredevil in his own animated series during the late 90s. And that wasn't the only time where a Daredevil cartoon was almost greenlit for production. So today, we're gonna go through every single time that a Daredevil TV series was considered for production and couldn't materialize. The earliest documented case that we know about happened in 1975, when Angela Bowie, the then current wife of David Bowie and mother of Duncan Jones, bought the TV rights for Daredevil and Black Widow to attempt to produce an entire show starring the two characters. Which kind of made sense at the time, since during the early 70s both heroes actually co-starred in the same comic book ongoing. Angela Bowie later gave more information about the potential show in a letter to a Daredevil fan magazine called Man Without Fear, where she said that she had received permission from Stan Lee himself to work on the series, and she did a photo shoot in London to present how the characters would have looked like for potential studios that might have picked up the series, with Angela Bowie playing Black Widow and actor Ben Carruthers as Daredevil. And while they did pitch the concept to several networks, they were rejected because it was considered too difficult and expensive to film at the time. Which might have been for the best really, since a series like this would have probably been pretty lackluster had they produced it during the 1970s. And that Daredevil costume might be the goofiest thing I've ever seen. I mean, the horns aren't even aligned with each other, and instead of giving him a mask, they literally painted his face. That's just silly. A few years later in 1979, Canadian comic book writer Martin Pascoe actually wrote a treatment for a potential Daredevil animated show and pitched it to Ruby Spears. Website manwithoutfear.com was able to purchase the first draft of the series, but the document hasn't been shared or fully detailed online yet, so we don't have that much information on the potential show beyond it starring Matt Murdock, with Foggy Nelson and Karen Page as supporting characters. So while we still haven't seen a solo Daredevil animated series to this day, it is kinda crazy to think that there were attempts at creating one more than 40 years ago. The next instance where a live-action Daredevil show was in development happened in 1983, when screenwriter Steven Silliphant wrote a script for a Daredevil pilot as part of a 3-pilot script contract deal he had with ABC at the time. And while we don't really know many details beyond that, we do know that the Daredevil script wasn't picked up for production. An interesting fact about Steven Silliphant, however, is that he did executive produce the 1971 series Longstreet, which revolved around a blind insurance investigator that solved crimes with a seeing eye dog, and it was based on novels from the 1940s written by author Baynard Kendrick. Also in 1983, we know that producer Irwin Allen was trying to develop a Daredevil TV series for Columbia Pictures Television based on a script by Tony Caden, and it was about an episode titled Blinded by the Light that establishes this version of Matt Murdock, whose last name is spelled with an H instead of a K, and who's trying to stop a fraudulent scheme by a corrupt businessman named Chris Tanner, who's burning down buildings in order to evict the residents and get ownership of the properties. It also introduces Foggy Nelson, Jack Murdock, and Karen Walker, who would have been Karen Page with a different last name. The entire script for the episode is summarized in a series of posts by manwithoutfear.com, and I'm gonna leave the link down below so you can read the script if you're interested, since it's the earliest script we have of one of the earliest attempts at making a Daredevil live-action show. Continuing with animated pitches now, Marvel was shopping around different concepts for potential cartoons to pitch for ABC, and in the 1985 issue of Comics Feature number 33, there was actually an article that published concept art from these different pitches, which included cartoons based on Iron Man, Ant-Man, a Teen Hulk, and also a show about a Hulk dog, which I've actually already covered on an old video where I talked about every cancelled Hulk TV show. The last of these pitches was a show about Daredevil, who would have been accompanied by a German Shepherd seeing eye dog named Lightning. Comic book writer Mark Evanier had actually worked on this pitch, and in an archived interview with CBR, he described how he was brought in to work on the series Bible after many writers, including Stan Lee, had attempted to make revisions on the concept to appease network executives, and that they actually considered many wacky gimmicks beyond just giving Daredevil a super dog. When Evanier was brought in on board, he tried to bring the tone of the pitch back to the classic version of Daredevil drawn by Wally Wood. Stories that had a lighter, swashbuckling adventure type feel, and that Lightning wouldn't have been a super dog per se, but he would have aided Daredevil on occasion, similar to the famous TV dog Lassie. Allegedly, ABC didn't go ahead with the pitch because an executive within the company campaigned against greenlighting the show due to Daredevil pivoting into becoming a more mature character in the comics at that time. And there's rumors that the cover for issue 184 with Daredevil holding a gun specifically made the studio executives decide to finally reject the show, and none of the other Marvel cartoon pitches were produced either. Throughout all those years that Daredevil was attempting to get his own show off the ground, there were other Marvel heroes who had successfully been adapted into live-action series, such as in 1977 with Spider-Man, and also the Hulk TV series, starring Bill Bixby and Lou Ferrigno. And years after that show had ended, it returns for a series of TV movies that were produced with the intention to use them as backdoor pilots for potential spin-off series to be aired on NBC. They considered making a Thor TV show, so they included his character in The Incredible Hulk Returns. And in 1989, they produced The Trial of the Incredible Hulk, which had David Banner being defended by his attorney Matt Murdock, played by actor Rex Smith, where they teamed up to fight against the Kingpin, who was played by John Rhys Davis. In an interview with IGN years later, Rex Smith confirmed that these Hulk TV movies were indeed meant to expand that version of the Marvel Universe and allow it to grow with more spin-offs. Both Daredevil and Kingpin were meant to return for this potential series, but unfortunately this never ended up happening, in part due to another superhero TV show. In the early 90s, CBS had greenlit and started production on the Flash TV series starring John Wesley Shipp, and CBS actually bought the contract for the Daredevil spin-off series from NBC in order to freeze the project and cancel it themselves, since the network didn't want any competing superhero shows to also be airing at the same time. That's a pretty wild and ruthless business strategy. And it's crazy to think that if they had never made a live-action Flash TV series in the 90s, we probably would have seen a Daredevil one instead. The last potential project we need to talk about would have also been a spin-off of another Marvel show. During 1999, Marvel Films Animation attempted to develop and pitch the idea of a Daredevil animated series, which would spun off from his appearances in the 90s Spider-Man episodes titled Framed and The Man Without Fear. There have been a few concept art leaked online which show some of the characters that would have appeared besides Matt Murdock, such as Elektra, the Punisher, Namor the Submariner, and the Kingpin. And given that the character designs seem pretty identical to their designs in Spider-Man the Animated Series, it's also reasonable to think that had the show been greenlit, we also would have seen the same voice actors reprise their roles, with Edward Albert as Daredevil and Roscoe Lee Brown as Kingpin. But sadly, there's not much else we know about the show, with it being ultimately rejected by Fox Kids. Despite all these rejected Daredevil pitches, we all know that the character did eventually get adapted into his very own series, which released on Netflix for 3 seasons starting in 2015. And this show came as a result of Daredevil's TV and movie rights being reverted back to Marvel in 2012, since they had been previously owned by 20th Century Fox for years until then, which is why we saw Fox produce the 2003 Daredevil movie starring Ben Affleck. Marvel Studios originally considered making a brand new movie set in the MCU, based on a pitch by director Drew Goddard. Marvel originally passed on Goddard's treatment at first, since it was going to be a truly dark, mature Daredevil story, and Marvel wasn't interested in making R-rated movies at the time. They eventually decided that Daredevil would be better suited for a TV series, and they originally hired Drew Goddard as its showrunner. But he later stepped down from that position in 2014 when he began working with Sony to write a script for a potential Sinister Six spin-off of the Amazing Spider-Man series. Goddard still served as an executive producer of the show's first season, and he also wrote its first 2 episodes, but he was replaced by Steven DeKnight as the showrunner of season 1, and the show ended up lasting for 3 fantastic seasons, though it ultimately ended up being cancelled on late 2018. And while there were surely many factors at play, the main reason why the show was cancelled was most likely because Disney was preparing to launch their own streaming service, and they had already began to slowly take away their catalog from Netflix. Since, as we all know, during the mid-2010s, Netflix made a deal with Marvel Television to produce a series of shows which would lead to a Defenders team-up. But of course, all of this stopped once Disney Plus was created. Prior to Daredevil's cancellation, however, the show's writers had already made their plans for what Season 4 was gonna be. Eric Olson, who worked as the showrunner of Season 3, has previously revealed that they were planning on bringing in the Owl and Typhoid Mary as the main villains of Season 4. The Owl would have been the son of Leland Owsley, who is the original Owl from the comics. But the character had already been adapted as Wilson Fisk's accountant on Season 1, where he was killed by Fisk. But during Season 1, the character had actually mentioned that he had a son, and this was laying the groundwork for the Owl to be adapted on the show. Typhoid Mary had actually already appeared on the Netflix Marvel shows during Season 2 of Iron Fist, but had the character appeared on a Daredevil Season 4, she would have been revamped and portrayed differently than how she was characterized on Iron Fist. Eric Olson also revealed that they didn't have plans for Bullseye in Season 4, but he was planned to make a comeback on a possible Season 5. Disney obviously was eventually going to do something with Daredevil, and we're currently very close to seeing the release of Daredevil Born Again on Disney+. But what's kind of funny about the show is that a version of it has already been scrapped. Born Again started shooting in early 2023, but it stopped its production due to the Writers Guild strike, at which point they had already shot about 18 episodes of the show. However, after reviewing what they had done, Kevin Feige and Marvel decided to make a revamp of the entire show, and they cut ties with the original head writers they had hired, choosing instead to heavily modify Born Again. I'm still personally looking forward to seeing this new show, mainly because of my love for the Netflix series, and while I would have loved to see that show continue after its third season and see its planned Season 4 and Season 5, that unfortunately just wasn't meant to be. But still though, I would absolutely love to see an animated series solely focused on Daredevil and his world. I love the Netflix series, and I'm excited to see Charlie Cox and the cast return for Daredevil Born Again, but I will always wish to see a Daredevil series in animation that's able to fully capture the tone and atmosphere from his comics, while being able to truly show his parkour rooftop action from the comics, like the short cameo on X-Men 97 showed. I just think that his stories could potentially be depicted more faithfully in animation. But what do you think? Would you also like to see a Daredevil animated series or movie? What stories from the comics would you like to see get adapted, whether it be on animation or in live action? And are you excited to see Daredevil Born Again? Please share your thoughts in the comments. And as always, thank you so much for watching.